From Capitol Hill is the House Minority Whip, Steny Hoyer. And Leader Hoyer, Congressman Hoyer, we watch what's been happening here. You've got to have a much better idea than we do. Where do you think things stand right now?
Well, we see a deeply divided party on the Republican side of the aisle who knew this crisis was coming. I advised in April, as we sat around the cabinet table with the president, we ought to solve this problem by the 1st of June and not push this country to the brink of default. Unfortunately, every effort to do that has been rejected. Every effort that, every meeting, every conference that's looked for compromise, the Republicans have walked out. And what Speaker
Boehner, you could say the same thing. I would agree with you that this should have been solved earlier. I agree with you 100%. But
let me make my point. No, let me make my point.
The Senate has not passed anything either.
Let me make my point. What the Speaker now sees is that his own members have walked out on him. The pattern of walking out, whether it was the Bowles-Simpson agreement, or whether it was the Biden talks, frankly, whether it was TARP, when President Bush said our country is in crisis, we're going to go into a depression, we need to pass something. 2/3 of the Republicans walked out on President Bush.
Congressman, I like you, but this is still arguing back and forth politics on this, and the Democrats have not come any closer to passing a plan. What's happening here, and will we actually see some sort of compromise where both sides get their own left and right wing in order, and that we find some common ground in the middle?
Look, any honest observer, very frankly, would say that the Reid plan, which has at least 53 votes, the majority of the United States Senate for it.
All Democrats.
That's correct. But it's essentially what Speaker Boehner set forth in his New York speech. It has no taxes in it. We think there ought to be revenues. So I think it is not a fair observation to say that Democrats have not put something on the table that, in fact, is a very, very substantial step towards the Republicans to try to solve this crisis. But the Republicans have said no. They cannot say yes to their own proposal of a $2.2 trillion, dollar for dollar increase in the debt, increase in spending.
Congressman, let's just get practical over the weekend now. So if the Boehner plan were to actually get passed, then we're going to move to the Senate. We're going to try to push these things together. How does it work? Can it work? And does it ultimately get left back to the House?
Well, first of all, obviously the Boehner plan, we all know, is not going to pass in the Senate, and they know that.
But if the Boehner plan can't pass in the House, how can the Senate plan pass in the House?
Well, the Washington Post said the adults ought to take over, and that's what ought to happen. We ought to come to an agreement.
Who are the adults?
Who are the adults?
Yeah, I mean, I'm confused at this point. We are days away, 4 days away from an absolute deadline. You yourself said that you've been pushing them to make sure that this got solved by June 1st.
Absolutely. As you know, the Republicans put a bill on to increase the debt limit, which everybody knew has to happen. Every Republican leader says it's critical.
Okay, but,
and they offered the bill solely
to game. Let's figure out what has to happen now.
Well, fine. What has to happen is the Republicans have to come to the table and compromise. But very frankly, an awful lot of people on our side of the aisle think the president and Democrats have gone way too far towards the Republicans already. So, we keep moving every day, every week, every month, and we don't get there. The Republicans walk out of the room, and then people like yourselves say, well, gee whiz, what more are you going to do? Well, we could put up the flag of surrender and see Medicare, Social Security savaged, see domestic spending savaged. We don't intend to do that. That's not what the American people sent us here to do. To make compromise, we're prepared to do that. We're prepared to look at triggers to make sure that the Reid committee has real effect. Frankly, we entered into a bipartisan agreement under Bowles-Simpson. We're prepared to pursue those alternatives. The Republicans walked out on it. Again, their position is
there's no time. There's no time for this now. Now we're down to minutes.
Let me ask you this, Congressman.
Frankly, we don't control the House, and very frankly, we can't get something through the Senate if Senator McConnell simply stamps his foot and said none of my people can vote for anything that has the majority support in the United States Senate.
You have a very valid point if nothing gets passed through the House, if Boehner cannot get this through the Republican Party. But we have been hearing a few things this morning that make us wonder if it's more likely that a vote comes today, and if Boehner's plan does pass in the House today, then it moves to the Senate, and the onus is on the Senate to try and come up with a solution. So at that point,
the onus ought to be on the Republicans who know that the Democrats.
No,
listen to me. We have a Democratic president and a Democratic Senate. Newt Gingrich was facing the same kind of scenario, and he talked to his Republicans and said, look, the perfectionist caucus cannot have everything its own way. We need to have compromise. And you'll remember when he compromised with Bill Clinton on a plan that led to us having surpluses for 4 years, he had a lot of his Republicans very angry at him, and perhaps he lost his speakership over that. You've got to compromise. We have to compromise, and I would suggest we have gone a long way towards compromise. And just because we don't go the final step and jump off the precipice with our Republican colleagues on bad policy, that doesn't mean we haven't sat down at the table. This president sat down at the table to try to get to compromise longer than any president in the 30 years that I've been in Congress. Now, you say that the bill, there has been no attempt to reach across the aisle to say to me or to Leader Pelosi, look, how can we come to agreement? How can we get to a majority? We don't have a majority on our side. There has been no attempt to do that. Why? Because they want to do it their way or no way.
You could be describing health care. I mean, I'm listening to everything you're saying right now. Wait a minute. Christmas Eve, passed reconciliation, no bipartisan. That's what ushered in these 82 guys. The 82-point difference in the House is the way that was handled, Steny. I mean, it goes both ways with both parties, right? I mean, this acrimony began long before that, but it certainly wasn't helped by the way you guys handled health care.
I think that's accurate. I don't think health care was handled the way it should have been, but let me tell you why. There was an openness to compromise, but the Republicans clearly said, look, we don't like your plan. We're not going to go there at all. And it was no, 100%. So there was no question of an attempt to bipartisan participation. That's not true when you look at Bowles-Simpson. Dick Durbin didn't like a lot of things in Bowles-Simpson, but he knew the problem had to be solved. He showed a lot of courage, stood up, and voted for Bowles-Simpson, just as a number of other Democrats did on Bowles-Simpson. So you can't say the Democrats haven't moved. You can't say the Democrats, including myself, on the Gang of Six, I've said the Gang of Six made sense. There's a bipartisan effort. That's been rejected by Republicans because they didn't want to go a bipartisan route. Why? Because they're absolutely dead set against any kind of revenues, which, of course, pay our bills.
But, Congressman, you have to admit that both parties are facing a wide variety of opinions. They have, both on the left and on the right, rogue elements of the party that have been very difficult to bring in line. You could go back to when we thought both Boehner and the president had a deal, and President Obama, it was reported, went back to his base and received an earful about how much he was giving up. So he came back in and changed the terms of the deal, looking for another $400 billion in cuts.
Yeah, that Mr. Boehner, no, let me say something about that, because I met with the president along with the Democratic leadership just before the meeting with Mr. Boehner. Very frankly, Mr. Boehner used that as an excuse, the $400 billion. There is no doubt in my mind.
Wait a second.
No,
he said he thought he had a deal. Was that not the case? There was not a deal and it was changed by $400 billion? I'm trying to, but I'm also trying to make sure we get to some substance before we run out of time.
Well, we're going to get to substance because the president did ask for $400 billion, a $1.2 trillion, similar to Bowles-Simpson. The fact of the matter is, Mr. Boehner came back to his caucus. Then the president called him to say, look, can we do this or not? I'm convinced if we couldn't have done it, there was $800 billion on the table, the president would have made that deal. I'm absolutely convinced of that. But Mr. Boehner walked away from the table. Why did he walk away from the table? For the very reason he can't get the votes for his own plan, because his caucus will not show that flexibility.
I'm not lauding anybody on any side of this. I think that there needs to be some decision
that's relatively clear. That's relatively clear.
But Congressman, honestly, when you look at the back and forth on this, when you look at the politics that seem to have played out and have driven this entire situation to the point where we are starting to really get worried if there's going to be a deal by this deadline of August 2nd, what has to happen now?
Let me say, I think this is the most severe crisis that I have seen our country exposed to 30 years I've been in Congress. I'm very concerned about this. This is a shameful performance by the Congress of the United States. It is putting the reputation and the fiscal posture of the United States at great risk. We should have made a compromise many weeks ago and months ago, very frankly.
Yeah,
but I will call your attention to the fact, you say you keep the blame game. Republicans walked out on George Bush at a similar time of crisis when the TARP was confronted. They walked out on President Bush, not just on President Obama. So this is not a new performance by the Republicans.
But Steny, that's interesting.
Do we need to reach compromise? I've been on the phone with United States senators who are good friends of mine, trying to figure out how we get from where we are right now to where we need to be. How we can compromise, how we can get some changes in the Reid bill so that we can get 7 Republican United States senators to join 53 Democratic senators to send a bill to the House, to have discussions, to have compromise. There have been no Democrats that Mr. Boehner has reached out to and said, look, if we make some tweaks in the bill, can you get substantial votes for it? No, it's all been within his own party to try to move further and further away from an agreement.
You did make some interesting news. I think that I've never heard anyone really concede that maybe the president was still bargaining with that $400 billion and maybe would have taken that off and come back to the speaker and maybe done the deal. I'm just wondering, do you think that if the 400 had come off, do you think that either side could have delivered on the votes for that bill? Do you think you could have gotten your side in line on the cuts to Medicare that the president was proposing and an entitlement? And do you think Boehner could have gotten his side on
those
with
400? The Democrats didn't. They had 400, but they didn't actually say what it was. Right,
but do you think that original deal before the 400, if you went back to it, could the president really have delivered the votes there, and could Boehner have delivered the votes on his side? Because that really does sound like a missed opportunity that we should all feel bad about, I think.
I think you're absolutely right. And the answer to that question is I think the President of the United States would have had a good opportunity at getting a significant number of Democrats to support a compromise. We knew that compromise was necessary.
I wonder if Boehner could have.
But Boehner could not have. Yeah. That's why he walked away.
Right.
And the proof in that pudding is he can't get his members to back his own deal. Forget about a compromise he made with the president. Because why? Because it had revenues. Who thinks we ought to have revenues? Every commission that has looked at this, and frankly, many of the Republican leaders that I talked to privately say you cannot get to where we need to get. We need to bring down the deficit. We need to bring down the debt. You cannot get there without dealing with every item of expenditure on the federal ledger.
I'm still hoping you're an old war horse. Are you going to be able to smile and walk out next week when everything's okay and everything's put together and both sides? And I mean, is that possible now? It doesn't even sound possible. Can you still smile? Let me see.
I can still smile.
All right, you got to walk out with the other side, and everybody's going to save it. Hopefully, that's what's going to happen.
I pray for that result.
Okay.
Would you give odds on it? I mean, you've been doing this a long time. You know how this stuff works.
I don't want to give odds, but I cannot believe that with the reputation and fiscal posture of the United States at risk, frankly, we cannot reach a compromise. But we're not going to reach a compromise just on our way or no way.
Okay.
I'm worried about the fact that he can't give odds.
You're right. Andrew, just do it for Andrew.
Just do it for me.
Senator or Congressman, please. Just do it for he's so worried.
With all due respect, we all need to do it for America.
You're right.
America is at risk. America's families are at risk. This is a serious crisis, and each needs to come to a place where we can get this done.
Couldn't agree with you more. Congressman Hoyer, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
All right, coming up, Sean Egan's biggest fears. They surprise you. That's next.
Yeah, it's a big mess.